Hi, everyone, and welcome to American Single Malt 101, our third episode. Tonight, we will be talking about how the mash bill goes through the distillate process. We are here with the folks from That's Neat. We're so excited to have you. Again, you can find them at their website or on their Instagram account. And if you're watching, we'd love if you could subscribe to our channel. And we have a great episode tonight talking about the distillery process and the distilleries we work with. So I'm going to let the guys take it from here. Sean, if you want to jump into the fermentation process, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, definitely. So fermenting is a word used a lot that people always wonder, what does that actually mean? It's just like this magical process that happens with turning things into alcohol. But I guess when it comes to like different whiskeys and stuff, again, I'm not like a distiller or anything, so I don't know all this stuff like at the back of my hand. But like what from my understanding is the result of mashing the malt creates a sugar solution called wort, W-O-R-T. And then this sugar has to get converted during a fermentation process where you have yeast added in with that wort. And this happens in, people might recognize those big pot stills, and they call them washbacks, I believe is the name for where the actual fermenting happens. Please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but that's the kind of what I've gathered through going on different tours before, and also from just some internet research, and some tutorials. But it's a cool process. But from my understanding, it looks like the wort or the sugar has to get cooled down before the yeast can get added in. And also you can add in different types of yeast for different types of fermentation, different types of chemical reactions. So essentially, once the yeast is added in, that's where the fun happens. We get different molecules happening. That's where the alcohol actually comes out of it. Once that actually happens. So there's some fancy formulas, which I won't even pretend to know what any of that means. But essentially what happens is the yeast now helps with, I think the carbon dioxide comes out of the molecules. You get ethanol, things like that. The alcohol comes out of it. And that's just kind of the short end, very rough summary of it. But definitely want to talk to you guys about the different types of yeast that can be used in fermentation. So what
I would, Sean, good overview. I hate to butt in, but
come on in.
Have you ever made homebrew beer?
I have not personally. I've had some friends that have done it. The closest thing I've ever brewed at my own house is some hard cider, and where it's like, see, you kind of get that frothiness that comes up, which is always fun to watch when the chemical reaction's happening.
What about you guys?
I've done a little bit with a friend of mine.
Right.
I don't know how legal it was, but
let's not talk. This is not a legal talk tonight. This is about
we did make some beer with some Brewers yeast.
But it's fun, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was fun. The beer was disgusting, but it was a lot of fun.
So what you're talking about, Sean, is
get into that for a while.
Is the making of beer basically without hops, and so the first step in the presence of enzymes that are present in malted barley, or at least the pale malt, big sugars are broken down into smaller sugars, and those smaller sugar and that process of breaking things down into the more usable sugars happens in water that is warmer. It's hot water, and we can talk about the difference there. Each of the distilleries, all of the distilleries that I've, work with whether it's getting information or actually doing distillation or fermentation distillation with them, they all focus on different things. And what you're all going to find out is some of the differences that result because of that. But even within the wort production and fermentation, there are big differences in what these various distillery partners focus on. So, for example, depending on what water temperature you use to allow that breakdown, enzymatic breakdown of sugars to smaller sugars, it makes a difference. So certain sugars will be produced in higher or lower concentrations, and so you can do a stepwise, super hot, less hot, type wort production. And then, as you said, you cool it down to a degree or to a temperature where yeast won't be killed. If you put yeast in super hot water, it will die. And if you put it in too cold water, it just doesn't have the energy to start doing its thing. And you mentioned yeast. Yeast is one of these things that some people hold in extremely high regard. Yeast is one of those fungi that people feel that the Lord gave us because of our good deeds, and I would probably tend to agree with that. I think that yeast is this magical organism that takes these raw materials, these sugars, these smaller sugars than you would typically find in nature, and it pops on the other side alcohol and other things too, like carbon dioxide and so on. That's what makes that frothy top on the top of a beer or a cider or whatever. And that's quite magical. That's amazing. And depending on what yeast you use, the types of alcohol molecules will differ. And then, depending on where that happens, where that fermentation process happens. So the size and shape of the fermentation vessels, the temperature of the water or the temperature of the environment, whether they control temperature. Some of these distilleries, like if you're in Texas, like not last week, but typically in the summer, it can get extremely hot. And if you're fermenting in a very hot environment like that, unlike the Pacific Northwest, different alcohol molecules will come out the other end, as well as other things like esters. And esters are a very, very interesting group of compounds that create a bunch of very pleasant, usually aromas and also tastes. So yeah, I find fermentation, I find first the breakdown of sugars fascinating, and I also find fermentation particularly fascinating, and what it makes in terms of beer, cider, wine, then the base liquid for us to distill into whiskey and these various other spirits is fantastic. I mean, that's amazing to have these things. And so we could go on forever, but Blake, sorry,
okay. I was actually just enamored with what you were saying.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
I had a question about the differences. I know a lot of modern, especially in the American single malt area of things, a lot of them are using a brewer's yeast now.
Yeah.
And if you had a preference or maybe you could describe the difference between a brewer's and a distiller's yeast.
I think the distinction, I should know this, but I think the definition or the distinction between a distiller's and a brewer's yeast is basically the percentage of alcohol that the yeast can tolerate. Champagne is one of these yeasts. Champagne yeast will tolerate a very high alcohol content, because basically as the alcohol concentration increases in a solution, all living organisms eventually die. I mean, alcohol is an antiseptic. A very high concentration of alcohol will kill most anything. That's why we use it as an antiseptic. So as the alcohol content increases, certain yeast varieties just don't survive. And so I think the major distinction between a distiller's and a brewer's yeast is that a distiller's yeast can survive in a higher concentration of alcohol, and then there are some that. But the main thing that you find with these various yeasts is the flavor profile. I mean, when you make a beer with an ale versus the different ale yeasts that you could use, even starting with the same base malt, you can end up with vastly different tastes of beer. And that's not even talking about the hops influence, but it's the same with making our base liquid for eventual distillation. If you use a brewer's versus a distiller's, or a combination, which we've done quite frequently, a combination of the two, your taste profile will change, sometimes dramatically. We often don't talk about the effect of yeast on the final taste profile. Many of these compounds that are produced by yeast, the various different yeasts, actually boil off at quite a low temperature. The esters are typically molecules that evaporate at a very low temperature. So many of them don't actually, the flavors don't follow through all the way through, And so I don't have a preference. I have a curiosity, though, and I really pay attention to what yeast we use at the various distilleries. One of the things that, I've always tried to make it easy for these good distilleries to work with us, obviously, because I really like to work with them. And if you go into a distillery or a brewery and start dictating what yeast you're going to use, you're probably, for the diehards, the people who are really paying attention, it can get very challenging for them, because what typically happens, and this can obviously vary, but depending on the age of the brewery or the distillery, you will basically create a small ecosystem within that building of a yeast strain. The yeast that you're putting into all of these worts, many of them will become the dominant yeast strain in the corners of the room where you don't sweep or you don't mop or you don't get to at all, the top of the room or whatever. So it's kind of gross to think about, but if you don't know much, but it's also very nice to think about, because you walk into a distillery and that smell, a lot of the smells you'll get are dependent on what they're actually doing, whether they're making wort or they're distilling or aging or whatever. But also many of those aromas are from the various organisms that are living there naturally, and the yeast that they use for the fermentation are a big part of that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, well, I've been on a few distillery tours and been to a few distilleries now. Marcus, you probably could speak to this a little bit more, but just like walking into Westland or walking into Copperworks, you kind of you get there.
There's a smell.
There's a smell, and it's distinct to that specific
very much
distillery.
So.
And then ever since then, you get that in every dram of whiskey. And I got that too. You guys aren't necessarily distilling your whiskey in your barn. You're aging it in your barn, but even everything in that barn, like, and then I come home and I have a dram of batch 1 or batch 4. It's just like,
there is a smell.
It's there. It's that
it's
barn.
So wonderful. It's so wonderful.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful. I have to tell you that every time I go to the barn and for the first time open the door, it's a big part of it is that first smell. And you never want to walk in there and get a foul smell. That would be horrible. And I never have yet. I hope I never do. We're not going to go into this tonight, but the environment that those barrels sit in is very important. And so one of the things that I really stress for us is making sure that there are no bad odors anywhere. So cleaning products or foul garbage things not cleaned or anything is super important. But you're right and typically, I'm a little biased, but the smell when you walk into a distillery, there are not many bad ones. There are a lot of really, really nice ones.
And they're also different too, which is part of the thing. Yeah.
Totally.
Well, and to your point on the smells, it's like you said, it's important. Most people are familiar with their fridge, right? If they leave something open in their fridge, right, you can wind up absorbing, if you leave some dish or something like that, you wind up absorbing onions or fish or something like that into it, and totally changes the flavor, totally changes everything. It's the same with whiskey, right? Barrel.
So, and also the ice that you put in your whiskey, you have to be careful what that ice sat in or where that ice sat, because like you say, it absorbs the smell. So if you have some whatever fish or thing, you don't want to have that going in your whiskey.
You will stay up at night, Phil. Does it keep you up at night, Phil? Wondering, like, oh, I hope our distillation and our farm doesn't have anything weird coming in to like ruin the bottles at all. I bet that's like probably on your mind all the time.
It is, but it also makes a difference for the stuff we store in there. We don't put things that have we don't put cleaning products. We don't put unchanged garbage bins. It sounds kind of overly, I don't know, crazy maybe, but it's important.
Whiskey sacred.
Yeah,
it is.
If you really smell, you might have a hard time getting a tour. Just kidding.
Exactly.
Yeah, you gotta watch the BS.
Yeah, definitely.
That kind of leads us into the distilling process there and everything about that. And maybe we could jump into what we do with the fermentation and the wort after it, when you guys deliver it to the distilleries. Marcus, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So it kind of, there is so much time and effort that goes into producing a whiskey, from all the way from choosing which grains you're going to use, up through fermentation, of course, which can take multiple days, anywhere from 3 to 4 to. Westland had a whiskey that they made out of a sourdough starter that took them 2 weeks to ferment, right?
Westward.
Westward,
right?
yes, not Westland. Westward, yeah.
Yeah.
So it can take a very long time for fermentation, and so when you get to distillation, there's a lot of effort that's already gone into it. And so you kind of want to, you want to make sure you know what's going on. You want to make sure you get this decision right too. And there are some key decisions at this step. For the actual equipment itself, there's a couple different types that you can use. You can use a pot still, you could use a column still, or you could use a hybrid still, which is just kind of a combination of the two. We could talk for hours and days and weeks about the different types of stills and the different pros and cons, and why you would use one for certain flavors and you'd use one for a different flavor. We don't have time for that. We're going to stick with pot still. Phil, correct me if I'm wrong. That's what you guys like to use, is pot stills for everything. Pot still is the sort of most traditional still that's used today. In certain places, it's actually required by law to use a pot still. If you're making Irish malt or Scottish malt whiskey, it's actually required by law to use a pot still. And same with cognac. If you're making cognac, it's actually required as well. So it's generally made out of copper. Part of that has to do with the way that copper reacts with the chemicals that are in the alcohol itself. It will change the flavor of your end product, the actual material of the pot itself. We had a graphic that popped up on the screen. If we could bring that up actually for just a second. When you're looking at a pot still, you can find a couple different major designs, but this one that's on the screen is sort of the most common. You have this sort of big bulbous bottom, which is the actual it's the actual pot itself, right? That's where your fermentation, that's where your fermented mash is going into. That's where the actual boiling happens, right? And moving up a little bit, you have some pot stills will just sort of have a big taper. A lot of them, though, will have a sort of secondary bulbous sort of another bulb on the top, and that acts as your sort of first step condenser, right? Where this vaporized liquid will condense the sides of it and start dripping back down. As it does that, the more it does that, it will again, it'll slightly change the outcome of what you have. The more it condenses, and so vaporizes, condenses, and vaporizes and goes up to the neck into the line arm, which is a tube that can connect the still with the condenser. Goes up through the line arm, goes into the condenser, and once it has condensed into a liquid again, and this is a really important bit, now you have a decision to make. Now you have a really important decision to make of the cuts, right? Of what it is that you're actually going out of this liquid. Generally, if you go on a distillery tour, you talk to a distiller or something like that, a lot of times they'll tell you there are 3 main cuts. There's head cuts, there's heart cuts, and there's tail cuts. And without getting too technical, of course, there are different flavors and different chemicals that boil at different temperatures, come off at different temperatures, and so come off at different times in the distillation itself. And so you end up with different flavors. And the head cuts, you wind up with really sort of sterile, reminds you of sort of rubbing alcohol. It's not a flavor that you really want, and it does actually have some harmful chemicals in there. So you generally will kind of push that off to the side. You don't want to keep those. And hearts are the main ones, so sort of a lot of the sweetness, a lot of the main characteristics, that is the actual liquid that you're going to put into a barrel. That's what you want as those heart cuts. And the last final things, the tails, you wind up with things like a wet dog smell or a wet cardboard smell. It's very specific scents and very specific chemicals that are coming out towards the end that sometimes you do want. If you're making a peated whiskey, sometimes you cut a little bit into the tails because there's certain flavors that come on a little bit later in the distillation that are in there. But usually there's stuff there that you want to pull out of it. So why don't we actually, Phil? I've got a question for you that's related to these. When you're going to a distiller, right, and you're saying, we've got our fermentation, we want it distilled, we want, this product. Where are you going with that? What are you looking for? Are you looking for a specific thing, or are you leaving it open to them to be like, hey, give us the best thing that we can get?
Well, I mean, typically we've come to the people that we feel are making good spirits, good single malt to begin with, so we know they have a knowledge and a track record that's, the ones we work with has been amazing. Most of them will do the fermentation as well as the distillation, and some we will breweries and then distilleries separately. And so, yeah, I mean, we're typically partnering with people who have the equipment and track record and knowledge that fits with what we're trying to do. I feel like we should, because of the volume of spirits that come off a column still, I think we should just touch on it briefly, especially, right now with alcohol sales high, a lot of what's being sold comes off a column still. So I think it's kind of nice to get an overview of what that is, what that does, and what the product that comes out the other end is, and why it can be good or not so good for certain things or people. A column still, so a pot still is an old technology that's been around for 2,000 years or so, and in various iterations depending on the materials that were available to make these things. Column stills or coffee stills are more modern. I mean, they're still very old. I can't remember when coffee actually invented it, but it's over 100 years ago. It's basically where you have a column that has a number of spouts off of it. Let's say you pour the wash in the bottom and you blow steam up you wash up from the top and steam from the bottom. So a heat source from the bottom, and coming off at various levels will be your various fractionated distillation. So at certain places, the first things that evaporate will come off. These things that you're talking about, the heads and the acetone, some of these dangerous compounds. In the middle of the various cuts, you will be able to pull off hearts. There we go, 1830. There it is. And then at various higher levels, you will pull off the fusel oils, the things that take a much higher temperature at the lower levels, the higher temperature to evaporate. And so it's a very controllable, clean. The cuts are super clean and extremely controllable, and that can be a good thing if you're making a bourbon or a rye, for example. You can make some fantastic spirits that way. But we single malt is made with pot stills, and I guess as an overview, we didn't talk. I don't know how much we talked about this earlier, but I don't want to bore people with the science of some of the more deeper science. But typically, what will happen in a distillery is you'll do a stripping run where you'll take your fermented your beer basically minus hops, and you'll put it in a stripping still, a very high volume still, and you'll run it through very quickly, and not quickly, I mean over a period of hours, and you will basically evaporate it down to a lower alcohol content, and you'll take what came off early, and that's your early stripping run, and that's what you'll put in your spirit still, and then you'll run that the second time. Sometimes it'll even be done the third time. We might touch on that, but you'll run that the second time in your spirit still, And it's that spirits run where then you'll really focus on those cuts. You know, you'll nose initially as things come across. It's really obvious. The tails are pretty obvious. You know, you've got a lot of acetone, some, like you mentioned, some medicinal, but very thin. They have a very unique odor. You'll also look very closely at the alcohol content. There will be a stepwise. The alcohol content of what's coming across, it's not like a straight line. There are drops that happen, and we will look, or the distillery, you know, things are done different. Again, this is a really nice thing to talk about. Different distilleries will focus on different things. So certain distilleries, it'll all be about the nose. So it'll be like, okay, we're on the spirits run again. We're talking about, okay, we're still in the first. We haven't made our first cut yet. Still a lot of acetone. Okay, we're into the nice. Now we're into the sweet stuff. Okay, let's start collecting now. We're starting to collect our hearts, and we'll keep going. And like you said, Marcus, we'll talk as you start getting into those less favorable odors where you've got some heavy concentration of fusel oils. People will make cuts at different places depending on, typically the way that I think about it is, if you want to make a really nice clean cut where you're eliminating a lot of spirit and you're making a really tight spirit hearts cut and not going too far into the tails, that's a whiskey that would probably take less time to mature. You have less, you know, ultimately what you're trying to do with aging is get rid of the bad things and keep a lot of the good things. And good things change in concentration, and there are also new good things that are produced from the barrel and also from oxidation.
You've got some less rough edges to sand off. You've got less rough edges to sand off. Yes, and so like you mentioned, you know, distilleries that are planning on aging for 8, 10 plus years, like many of the scotches, they will go deep into those fusel oils. Like you'll get some really oily, or it's actually oily, some of it, but it's very long chain molecules that are very flavorful, but initially not the best flavor. Like you said, some of these wet cardboard, wet dog type things. I mean, these are things that typically people would not want to have in their whiskey. But if you stick it in a barrel for 8, 10, 20 years, it can be fantastic, especially if you have some of those phenol compounds from the peated malt. So it depends on what you're trying to make, you know, and so we're a non-peated whiskey. We are looking to release a product that is aged, mature at 3 to 4 years plus. So we're not going deep into those fusel oils. We don't want to. And then we can talk. This is not a talk about maturation, but making those cuts, determining where those cuts should be, there's a plan before you start. It's not just like, okay, we're into the good stuff. We're into the good stuff. Now we're in the bad stuff. You have a discussion and a plan about that before you even start to do your spirits run. And it matters, because if you make those cuts poorly, it may take more than 4 or 5 years to have a mature whiskey. Or also you may throw away a lot of really nice flavors, which is also a shame, you know? So, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
no, that makes total sense. I was just kind of thinking back to column versus pot still, and if you as a American single malt distiller or producer, you prefer the pot still, but could you maybe touch on a little bit about like what the outcome or the differences in the outcome between a column and a pot still?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, I love a lot of spirits. I love a good rye. I love a good bourbon. And what I like about those column still produced spirits is it's for me, thin is not the right term to use, and clean is not the right term to use either, but you have a flavor. So when you have a pot still as opposed to a column still, you talked about Marcus initially, where you have this bulbous thing where you have a bunch of liquid and you heat it up. You typically have a steam jacket that heats it up. Things start to bubble and evaporate, and then you have sides of that pot still where things will hit, and the surface of that is cooler. It's typically made of copper to get rid of some of the sulfur compounds, but liquid will hit the surface of that, and some of it will condense right away, and then others of it will make it up into the more enlarged pear-shaped portion. There can be various shapes and sizes, and again, you'll get some evaporation and drip back. The line arm, the angle of the line arm, the length of the line arm, whether it's angled up or down, that'll make a huge difference, because if it's angled up and you have evaporate going up into that line arm, and it can condense anyway up that line arm, and then it drips all the way back down again. And so what you're having happen there, what I think about is happening there, is you have so many different molecules with different evaporation temperatures that are making their way up the various stages of that pot still and up into the line arm before they're anywhere close to the condenser. And some of them inch their way all the way through and make it all the way through. And others, most of them, have such a back and forth route. And what I think about happens there, which is a good thing, is that you have so many more varieties of molecules and tastes making its way to the condenser. Whereas when you take a column still, a coffee, a column still where you've got these various places to pull off liquid, condense it. It's actually pulled off as vapor and then it condenses. It's much more clean and controlled, and there's very little back and forth. There's no back and forth, and so when we talk about making cuts on a pot still, it's somewhat of an exact science, but not that much, really, especially when you compare it to a column still. And that can be a good thing for some things, like, there are some bourbons and ryes made in column stills that are fantastic. I also particularly like them for making cocktails, because that you've got, what's there. And it's, if you add that rye to your Manhattan, you're pretty clear on what's going to come out the other end if you add a certain whatever sweet vermouth.
Would you say that it's kind of like a consistency that you can get out of
I think the way I would describe it is a breadth of tastes. You take a big single malt, like hopefully ours, or any well-made single malt, breadth of taste. That's why we talk about, these tastes or these smells. We've probably talked about this, but the number of things you can smell are vastly greater than the number of things you can taste. But so when you start to pay attention to the various things you can smell, the breadth of those various things in a single malt is much made in a pot still, I think personally, and this is a personal opinion, but I think it can be probably borne out in if you did gas chromatography or whatever. But you have a much broader array of tastes to perceive in a single malt than you do with a column-made spirit overall, and that's good for some people. For me,
definitely.
But, not for everybody, I guess.
I think they both definitely have their benefits,
Sure.
depending on what you're trying to make. But I mean, that kind of leads me into some questions I had for you, and the different distilleries that we're working with, and the philosophies and different stills that they might have, and the flavor outcome. Maybe you could talk a little bit about each one, and how their stills and their philosophies, and maybe the yeast that they use, if it's different each time, kind of impacts that flavor? Maybe start with the evergreen with Westland and.
Yeah, so I don't think it would be helpful because, to be quite honest with you, all of these distilleries, including Westland, they are run by people who pay attention to the important things, but they do pay attention to different things.
Mhm.
They're all aware of the basic concepts that need to go into making a good whiskey, but some of them, wow, that was a while ago. Some of them pay attention to different things. So I know that Westland, Matt Hoffman pays attention to every step, but he was, when I was working with him years ago, he was, temperature of the initial enzymatic sugar breakdown was the temperatures of the various steps was important. The fermentation took place in the Northwest, and so it was at a temperature that was, well, what the Pacific Northwest would be. And yeast was definitely important, and ale yeasts and brewer and distillery yeast were used. The distillation is done in a gorgeous, stripping, and then a spirit still made in the U.S. There are plates on those stills, so I guess you could call it a hybrid, but it's a pot still. The water was from the Northwest, and then you have places that we've worked with in Texas where they had to be more conscious of, in the fermentation, about temperature. They live in a climate, in the summer at least, that's very hot. And I don't know if they have the picture of this, but they have one of the most fantastic spirits still you'll ever see. It looked like a freaking, just like Charlie Chocolate Factory type stuff. The line arm is so long that it's wrapped around like a corkscrew over the top, and it's fantastic to look at. It looks gorgeous. And so obviously you're going to get a ton, Marcus, we talked about this earlier, you're going to get a ton of reflux and back and forth there, because what a distance this little alcohol molecule has to travel all the way up this corkscrew. And the lucky ones that make it through are they've gone quite a journey. So and then again, they have a similar, their yeast choice is similar to it's not the same, but it's similar in terms of philosophy to Westland. And then our Virginia, they are a really amazing. The facility there is beautiful. It's
that's beautiful.
It's really classic.
Wow.
You see a lot of Scotch influence in their equipment and their processes, and fantastic. They really pay attention. They're nosing. They really pay attention to alcohol content, concentration drops, and did I say Virginia? I did say Virginia, didn't I?
Yep.
And so, yeah, it's, I won't go into the minutia of the discussions we've had with these, but it's so wonderful, the breadth of the things that these guys pay attention to, and what we discuss when we're talking about our strategy for making the whiskey that we're wanting to make, and then the wonderful equipment that they have to use. It's really amazing. I'm hoping that we will be able to continue working with these guys and gals, and they all bring a different thing to the table. They all pay attention. They pay attention to the basics and to the McCarthy's another one. These guys have a facility very close to ours, and we have an amazing brewery tradition in the Hood River area. And what a dork I look like. God almighty, it's just crazy.
Oh, you look good next to all those barrels of whiskey.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a nice place to be. Those guys, they use these stills that they've been using, these smaller stills. They have a series of them, and Joe, these guys, they know how to work them like magic. It's watching them work them and pull the cuts off of each of them is fantastic. It's really fun, and so yeah. I mean, I know that's broad strokes. I haven't gone into the big details of all the things, but suffice it to say that
early process. So it's
they pay attention to the important basic concepts of making a good whiskey, but then they each focus on different things that are wonderful and matter and make a difference. And so what's going to be fun is to see these things bear out in the final product for what we release, and how we can then talk and compare and do those sorts of things with people.
Yeah, I'm super excited for all those collaborations. There are
it's fun.
Some of my favorite distilleries, Westland, Balcones, Virginia, McCarthy's, especially McCarthy's. They've been close to my heart for a long time.
I know, right? Yeah.
But maybe we could, this is a good wrapping up point, I think. Maybe we could bring back Maggie, and we could wrap it up and call it good. This was great. This was very informative. I really liked this session tonight. It was really good.
I learned so much. This is the type of classes I wish I was taking. Like, just doing a whiskey distilling 101 is a class I would definitely take at college if it existed.
I know, right?
Sure, it does somewhere.
Oh, it does.
Time really does fly when you're having fun. I can't believe that was a full 40 minutes, a very full 40 minutes. What an awesome, informative session. I want to thank you all for coming on and joining us again. It's been really great. We've all learned a lot. Again, thank you. That's Neat for joining us. You guys can be found anywhere you can stream podcasts. Great website. And we appreciate it if everyone can subscribe to our YouTube page. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our final ASM 101 talking about barrel aging. And we hope everyone who's on can join us for that as well. So thanks so much, everyone. And I hope you have a great night. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye. Awesome. Thank you.